Hello, my name is Sean Morris. I'll be doing the Proposition Third speaker on the motion. This House would require individuals to pass a political general knowledge test in order to vote. On the proposition side of the House, then, the three anticipated arguments would be firstly, a principle of consent and democratic legitimacy, secondly, preventing populist manipulation, and thirdly, civic engagement. On the opposition side of the House, the first argument would be a principle of democracy, secondly, discrimination and neglect of marginalized communities, and thirdly, political backlash. With that said, I'll start with my first word. The most basic premise of democracy is majority rule with a protection for minority rights. The status quo that side opposition was so willing and so eager to fight for in today's round has incentivized violent rhetoric and abusive policies that slowly have eroded those very protections for the most vulnerable. At that point, even if you're buying the push that the political knowledge test on our side of the House has the possibility for discrimination, we were willing to roll the dice because the deplorable and untenable conditions of the status quo cannot continue any longer in its current form. On that basis, so proud to oppose. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. Firstly, I have some key clarifications on framing that still need to be addressed, followed by the three key clash questions that are going to implicate and close down your ballot for side proposition. On framing then, firstly note, remember, this House would is a policy motion inherently in world schools debate, so we have the fiat power here as the proposition to model out what this political knowledge test was going to look like in the first place. Firstly, we tell you this test would measure objective functions of civic literacy, like say the purpose of checks and balances, what unconstitutional versus unconstitutional behavior looks like, or the overall value and function of democratic institutions. Secondly, though, we would also provide publicly available information and guidance on how to pass this test. We think this is probably accompanied by things like civic education in school or civic literacy requirements in order to graduate. And thirdly, we think this test on our side of the House can be retaken as many times as a person wants on a yearly basis. It's not a one-time thing. The entire opposition push thus far in this round has literally been a regurgitating claim that just like discrimination happens on your side of the House. I think this was very uncharitable in terms of just like setting up the round, but it also is indicative of the fact that the only lens in which they understood this argument was by comparing it to Jim Crow era literacy tests in the South that were obviously used in a very racist way. We think on that basis, where they're just not understanding or not choosing to interact and engage with our model head on in a charitable way, you're already siding with the proposition then in this round. We think this model in this test is much more akin to something like say the US citizenship test. The second note on framing, though, we would also tell you that only countries with strong democratic infrastructure are likely to implement this test in the first place. This was because of two reasons. Firstly, it was never our burden to prove that every single country in every single jurisdiction could reasonably or meaningfully implement this test in the first place. But secondly, though, we think that in emerging democracies like the one you see in Nigeria, it's very hard for the government to justify with enough popular support a policy in the name of democracy, so they're unlikely to do this. Moving on then to the first clash question in today's round, what did it mean to be democratically legitimate and which side of the House fulfilled it the most? Their best argument here was a push on the principle of democracy. They say that insofar as governments maintain a monopoly on violence it can use against you, that can only be justified when all citizens have the ability to influence the course of laws that are placed onto them. A couple of principled responses here. Firstly, we tell you about the principle of consent. We think democracy is only legitimate when citizens understand the systems and laws they are consenting to. The misinformation and populist rhetoric incentivized on their side of the House by large amounts of uninformed voters actively diluted that consent overall. In terms of weighing, you're always going to outweigh a hollowed out democracy of uninformed voting with one in which citizens understand what they were functionally consenting to in the first place. The second response here, though, we think that the social contract dictates that when people come together to form governments and consent to laws, they do so under the premise that their rights sometimes must be limited for collective benefit. Remember, we tell you that voting inherently was a collective action that determines not only your life or the life of, say, your family, but the life of every single person in the nation. Thus, it needs to be treated and viewed as important as it is. This is literally the precedent of democracies, right? Look at something like the restrictions on freedom of speech usage. I can't go out and yell in the middle of a crowded theater that I have a bomb. The third and final response here then, they tell you that on their lowest ground where abusive populist candidates come to power, if it's what the people want, then that's what should happen because that's the primary objective of a democracy. But we fundamentally disagree because we never thought that a tyranny of the majority was a democracy in any meaningful sense of the word. For example, electing an administration that uses ICE to racially profile people or absolves their rights to due process from immigrants is not a democratically legitimate outcome, even if it's what the people want. The fourth and final response to note here then, we think that the mandate generally of democracies is to maximize preferential outcomes for their constituents. We already are willing to subordinate democracy for things like the appointment process for the Federal Reserve or the appointment process for judges because we understand that's what gets you the most amount of practical outcomes. So even if you're buying that their role is principally better on some moral level, we think the practical harms of upholding such a principle far outweigh the moral benefits of upholding that same principle. In other words, other clashes, the practical clashes in this round, need to be taken top priority on your ballot. Speaking of other clashes then, the second voting issue in today's round is which side of the House best maximized accountability. Firstly, the analysis that we gave you here is that under our side, voters have the knowledge necessary to hold politicians accountable when they abuse their power or do something illegal. In general, when people understand the necessity and value of democratic institutions, they value democracy in a much bigger way on our side of the House, making it less likely that they vote undemocratic candidates into power in the first place. This effect effectively prevents democratic backsliding. At this point, we implicitly answer their accountability arguments because the comparative world that they needed to defend is actually far worse. The third thing to note here then, speaking of the comparative, what does the opposition tell you on accountability? They say that citizens who can't vote can't meaningfully hold politicians accountable on our side of the House. Firstly, maybe this is true in the short term, but remember, political parties operate on long-term incentives to stay in power for a long period of time. The weighing here then is extremely clear. In terms of time frame, on our absolutely lowest ground, in the short term, unaccountability is simply outweighed by the long-term health of democratic institutions and the strength of democracy on our side. Secondly, though, even if people don't end up passing this test on our side, the possibility that they do creates a deterrent effect for politicians to still be accountable. And third and final mitigation here then, even if you're buying absolutely none of that, the incentive of politicians to be accountable still exists regardless of people's ability to influence them electorally. It exists as a desire to, say, avoid protests or riots, or simply appear optically good to their constituents. The final clash question then in today's round, which side of the House best protected marginalized communities? This is the most important stakeholder in the entire round. These are the communities that have been forced under a system of oppression and disenfranchisement that meant that they were the ones that needed to take priority on your ballot because they're the vulnerable communities that have historically been oppressed. Firstly, they tell you that the arbitrary nature of political knowledge is a slippery slope to authoritarianism and discrimination. Okay, firstly, notice the phrase slippery slope they use here. I didn't know that side opposition was speedrunning logical fallacies. They don't really mechanize this for you. But secondly, though, more seriously, again, they're ignoring the purpose of our model. This was a This House would motion that was very explicit and very specific, because if it was a This House believes or some other form of motion, then sure, maybe we would consider the most likely manifestation of such a policy and test overall. Thirdly, though, we think that in democracies, voting rights are viewed as so sacrosanct, so governments have an incentive to implement this test in good faith. But secondly, though, on the idea that marginalized communities will be disenfranchised and neglected on our side of the House, de-link this argument insofar as a history of discrimination and disenfranchisement for these communities is likely to galvanize and give them the greatest incentive to participate and pass this test in the first place on our side. For all those reasons, because we safeguard democracy and the people in it, so proud to propose.